A thin, early morning mist drifted across the valley, softening the sharp edges of the barracks and turning the camp into a series of pale shapes barely anchored to the earth. The Italian guards moved quietly at this hour, their boots pressing gently into the damp soil, as if even they respected the silence that settled here before sunrise. Beyond the wooden fences, distant hills rose in muted blues and grays, carrying the first hints of light. It wasn't a harsh place, not in the way war usually imagined itself. Instead, it felt suspended, caught between duty and a strange, reluctant gentleness. The air smelled faintly of wet wood, cold iron, and last night's cooking fires, now reduced to soft embers. Somewhere, a kettle hissed. Somewhere else, a lone bird broke the quiet with a hesitant call, unsure if morning had truly arrived. Inside the camp, the Austro Hungarian captives stirred slowly, their breath fogged in the cool air, rising like tiny clouds that vanished as soon as they formed. Men wrapped coats tighter around their shoulders, not only against the cold. They remembered the moment of arrival not as a single scene, but as a blur of exhausted faces, trembling hands, and the hollow ache that follows long marches with no clear end. The Italian camp had appeared almost quietly, without the menace they expected. Just fences, modest barracks, and guards who watched with steady, unreadable eyes. Yet uncertainty clung to every man like a second skin. Their uniforms were worn thin, their boots softened by mud and miles, and their thoughts scattered between fear of the unknown and the fragile hope that at least the journey had stopped. Some tried to stand tall, as if dignity could shield them from whatever waited inside. But even they exchanged quick glances, searching for reassurance in one another's expressions. What troubled them most wasn't the physical space, but the questions that rose in the silence. Would they be treated harshly? Would their families ever learn where they had gone? Could an enemy ever show mercy in a world that seemed deeper into the camp? A quiet truth settled among them. They were no longer soldiers, only men trying to understand what survival might look like now. In the days that followed, the men began to notice small details that didn't quite fit the image of captivity they carried in their minds. It was nothing dramatic, just soft moments that lingered quietly at the edges of their routines. A guard who allowed an extra minute in the morning sun before calling them to assembly. A cook who slid an extra piece of bread onto a tray without meeting anyone's eyes. Even the way the gates opened each dawn with a calm creak rather than a shout or the strike of a rifle butt suggested something different, something gentler than the stories they had braced themselves for. These moments were subtle enough to ignore, yet impossible to forget. They found themselves listening more closely to the camp's sounds, sensing that its silence was not the silence of threats, but of waiting for something they couldn't yet name. There was a faint shift in the air, a kind of permission that hadn't been spoken aloud, but seemed to drift through the camp like a soft breeze. The men didn't trust it fully. War had trained them to doubt anything that felt kind. Still, they noticed. And in the noticing, a quiet anticipation began to form, as if the camp held small unseen doors that might open one by one. The announcement came on a mild afternoon, when the light fell softly across the yard, turning the dust into a pale golden haze. The men had gathered for the usual roll call, expecting nothing more than the familiar count, the routine instructions, and the slow return to their assigned tasks.
But the Italian officer who stepped forward carried a different tone in his voice, calmer, almost hesitant, as if he understood the weight his words might carry. He explained, in simple, measured phrases, that each prisoner would now be allowed to write a letter home once every week. Not a dictated message or a censored postcard forced into cold military language, but a personal letter in their own hand, sent through official channels to the families they feared they might never see again. For a moment, the camp seemed to hold its breath. Some men lifted their heads slowly, unsure if they had heard correctly. Others stared at the officer with a kind of dazed wonder, their minds reaching toward memories of wives, children, parents, and quiet homes left behind. A warmth spread through
The news moved through the camp like a soft ripple, touching each group of men in its own quiet way. Some reacted instantly, their faces breaking open with a relief so raw it looked almost painful. A younger soldier, barely past boyhood, pressed both hands to his mouth as if trying to hold back a sudden rush of emotion. He whispered his mother's name under his breath, the syllables trembling out of him like something rediscovered. Nearby, two older veterans exchanged a long, steady glance. No smiles, no outward display, but in their eyes there was a heaviness lifting, the shared recognition of a hope they had buried for survival's sake. Others took longer to absorb it. A group from the empire's southern provinces sat together in silence. There were also those who responded with nervous laughter, shaking their heads in disbelief, as if the absurdity of mercy from an enemy made the war suddenly feel stranger than ever. They joked softly about what they might write, but beneath the humor lay a deep, aching sincerity. In those moments, the prisoners were no longer defined by uniforms or allegiances. They were simply men reaching, in their own cautious ways, toward the thread of connection being offered to them. The first letters appeared that evening, scattered across crude wooden tables like fragile pieces of another life. Men hunched over them with a reverence usually reserved for prayer, their shoulders curved inward as if protecting something delicate from the world around them. The paper was thin, coarse in places, but to the prisoners it felt soft, almost luxurious, a surface where memories could finally land after drifting for so long without a place to rest. Some began writing immediately, their pens moving with an urgency that surprised even them, words tumbling out faster than they could steady their breath. Others paused, a few whispered sentences aloud, testing how they sounded in this strange space so far from home. A man wrote about the smell of his mother's kitchen, another about a child who might have grown taller in his absence, and another simply about being alive. The quiet scratch of ink filled the barracks, blending with the soft sighs of men who had suddenly rediscovered their own voices. In those letters, the camp loosened its grip, and the war seemed to fade, replaced by the gentle pull of lives waiting far beyond the fences. For many of the prisoners, the act of writing became more than a routine. It became a quiet return to themselves. Each letter allowed them to step outside the harsh outlines of captivity. And these letters were not simply messages, they were anchors. They reminded the men that they belonged somewhere, that there were people who cared whether they lived or disappeared beneath the tide of war. With every line, they found themselves breathing a little more deeply, shoulders relaxing as memories became a refuge instead of a torment. The act of remembering brought color back into their inner world, the scent of spring fields, the sound of a child calling from another room, the comfort of familiar voices speaking their names. Even those who struggled to write felt the quiet relief of knowing they could. The possibility itself was enough to soften the edges of captivity. And as ink settled in the paper, something else settled too. A small, steady belief that they were still human, still connected, still capable of being more than prisoners in a distant land. Italy's approach to prisoner care during the war was shaped by a mixture of policy, culture, and circumstance, an approach that often surprised those who entered its camps expecting only the hardness of an enemy's hand. Unlike some nations caught in the brutal tides of total war, Italy adopted a relatively humane framework for POW treatment, influenced by international agreements, but also by a national temperament that leaned toward moderation rather than cruelty. The government understood that the war was grinding down its own soldiers as relentlessly as any foe, and perhaps because of this, there was a quiet recognition that suffering needed no deliberate reinforcement.
Malinconia turned into serena gratitudine. Italian officials were instructed to provide conditions that met basic standards of dignity: access to medical care, opportunities for light work, and limited forms of recreation when possible. Though resources were strained and rations never abundant, there remained an unspoken effort to keep the camps from slipping into the realm of despair. Some of this came from practical motives. Treating prisoners well encouraged reciprocal treatment for Italian soldiers held elsewhere. But much of it reflected a cultural instinct toward small kindnesses, gestures that carried weight even when the country itself struggled under wartime shortages. Allowing weekly letters was part of this philosophy. Italian officials believed that maintaining a prisoner's emotional stability reduced tension within the camps and prevented the desperation that often led to unrest. They understood that a man who could reach across distance to his family was less likely to collapse under the psychological strain of confinement. And so, amidst the conflict known for its unforgiving brutality, Italy carved out pockets of humanity, creating spaces where a prisoner might still feel.
Over the weeks that followed, a subtle shift settled over the camp, so gradual that it was felt long before it was fully understood. The men moved with a little more steadiness, as if the weight on their shoulders had been quietly lightened by the steady rhythm of writing and receiving replies. Morning roll call no longer carried the same sharp tension. Instead, it passed with a muted calm, a shared understanding that each day now held something to look forward to. Even the guards noticed the difference. Their commands softened, their glances lingered with a trace of familiarity, and the rigid distance between captor and captive thinned into something more human. The evenings changed most of all. Where once the barracks fell into heavy silence, now they hummed with the low murmur of men reading aloud a line from a letter, or sharing a memory stirred awake by ink and paper. Laughter returned,
yet inside the camp, a quiet hope began to take root, fragile but persistent. And in that new atmosphere, the prisoners sensed that their world, though limited, was slowly opening into something deeper than simple survival. For the Italian guards, the camp carried a tension they rarely spoke about, a quiet struggle between the role they were sworn to play and the humanity that surfaced in the quieter hours. They were soldiers, shaped by orders, discipline, and the relentless uncertainty of a war that stretched far beyond the fences they patrolled. Yet each day they found themselves tending not to enemies in the traditional sense, but to tired men whose suffering looked remarkably similar to their own. It created a kind of moral crossroads, one where duty demanded distance, but compassion kept drawing them closer. Some guards tried to hold to the rigidity of their position, keeping their voices firm, their expressions unreadable. But war had worn them down too, softening the. They saw the prisoners' hunger, their longing for news from home, the way their shoulders eased when clutching letters that arrived like rays of light through heavy clouds. These moments chipped away at the hardened instinct that military life had built.
The guards found themselves offering small gestures, an extra ladle of soup, a slower pace during inspections, a nod that carried quiet reassurance. It didn't erase their duty, but it complicated it, blending obedience with empathy in a way that made the war feel almost surreal. In the stillness of the camp, far from the front's chaos, some guards began to wonder whether humanity itself was the one thing they were truly responsible for protecting. They began to notice one another in small human ways that had nothing to do with uniforms or orders. It happened during slow afternoons when the sun warmed the yard and shadows stretched lazily across the ground. A guard might pause near a work group, asking in halting German if the men were managing the task or needed a rest. Sometimes a prisoner would respond with equally hesitant Italian, surprising them both into brief.
There were moments when a guard would hand over a tool already sharpened, sparing a prisoner the extra effort, or offer a cigarette with a shy gesture that dismissed the idea of sides entirely. The prisoners, in return, shared fragments of their lives, names of children, memories of distant villages, stories that softened the hard edges of their captivity. Even laughter, cautious at first, began to slip into these small interactions, rising gently, like birds startled into flight. These encounters didn't erase the reality of the war, but they reshaped it. They reminded both groups that kindness could exist even within boundaries marked by barbed wire. In these quiet moments, compassion became a language of its own, one spoken in nods, shared glances, and the soft murmur of conversations that drifted away on the breeze. And with each exchange, the line separating captor and captive blurred just a little more, revealing a shared desire, simply, to feel human again.
Trust did not arrive suddenly. It gathered slowly, like water seeping into dry soil. At first the prisoners watched the guards with cautious eyes, expecting every small kindness to hide a condition or a trap. Years of conflict had taught them that enemies rarely gave without taking. Yet as days folded into weeks, the pattern of quiet decency persisted. Simple, steady gestures that asked for nothing in return. A guard who always checked that an injured soldier's bandage was secure. Another who took extra care when translating a message, ensuring no meaning was lost in the crossing of languages. These moments accumulated until the men found themselves relaxing in ways they hadn't allowed since the war began. Some prisoners began speaking more openly, sharing stories that held both sorrow and pride. They noticed the guards listening, not out of duty, but genuine interest, nodding with understanding even when words faltered. Respect formed in the quiet spaces between sentences, in the shared fatigue of men who were all far from home and tired of the endless weight of conflict. It wasn't friendship. War kept that boundary intact. But it was something gentler, something closer to mutual recognition. And as trust took root, it opened the door to deeper emotions waiting just beyond the horizon of the story.
The letters that arrived from home felt almost strangely heavy in the men's hands, as if they carried not just ink, but the weight of entire lives waiting beyond the mountains. Each envelope was a small universe of longing, its edges softened by travel, its paper warmed by the hope that had been tucked into it miles away. Men opened them slowly, with a reverence that bordered on fear. Fear of bad news, fear of silence between familiar lines, fear of learning how much the world had changed without them. Yet even when the words carried grief or worry, they offered a form of closeness that nothing else in captivity could. A mother's trembling handwriting, a child's uneven letters, a wife's quiet strength woven into every sentence. These were reminders that love persisted stubbornly, even across borders scarred by conflict. Some letters spoke of empty chairs at dinner tables, harvests gathered without familiar hands, or prayers whispered each night for a safe return. Others were filled with small.
Far away from the camp's quiet routines, families received the prisoners' letters with a mixture of trembling relief and lingering fear. In kitchens warmed by the smell of bread or soup, stretched thin by rationing, mothers unfolded the pages with hands that had aged more quickly than they realized. Their eyes moved slowly across familiar handwriting, tracing every curve as if touching the face of the son they'd last seen at the door of their home. The words were often simple, assurances of health, cautious optimism, but to those reading them, they felt like a lifeline thrown across an ocean of uncertainty. Some cried softly, not from sorrow, but from the unbearable tenderness of knowing their sons were still alive, still thinking of them, still reaching across distance with fragile hope. Wives read their letters in quiet corners, where no one could see the private storm of emotions stirring within. They smiled at affectionate phrases, held the paper to their lips, and reread lines that carried hints of the men they loved, their humor, their steadiness, the warmth that had filled their homes before uniforms replaced ordinary clothes. Each letter became a small promise, a reminder that despite the war's crushing reach, their bond had not been severed. Children clutched the pages too, tracing their father's handwriting with clumsy fingers, asking.
Neighbors gathered to share their own news, creating small circles of comfort in a world shadowed by conflict. In these homes, the letters were more than messages. They were moments of breath, of courage renewed. And with every envelope opened, the distant camp merged briefly with kitchens and living rooms, binding both sides of the war with threads of human longing that refused to break. Life inside the camp and life beyond its fences seemed to exist in parallel worlds, each moving at its own quiet pace, yet bound together by the fragile bridges carried through letters. In captivity, days unfolded with predictable rhythm, roll calls, simple meals, moments of rest. And though the men had grown accustomed to this steady pattern, it carried a faint echo of emptiness. Their universe was small, contained within wooden walls and
Outside, families lived in a world shaped by very different currents. Seasons changed, crops grew or failed, children learned new words or outgrew old clothes, and neighbors whispered the latest rumors from the front. Life moved forward with a momentum the prisoners could only imagine, marked by both quiet joys and relentless worries. And though the letters connected these two realms, they also made the distance feel sharper, like a soft ache that lingered after the last line was read. Between captivity and home lay a space filled with tenderness and sorrow, reminding the men that even in stillness, the world beyond was waiting, changing, surviving, and hoping alongside them. In a world shaped by confinement, the men began to understand that freedom did not always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it lived in moments so small they could almost be missed. The warmth of morning sunlight slipping between wooden boards, the faint scent of pine drifting in from the hills, the gentle ritual of unfolding a letter and knowing that someone far away still spoke their name with love. These fragments of life, scattered across days that otherwise felt
Heavy and restrained, carried a quiet power. They reminded the prisoners that even within harsh boundaries, the human spirit could find places to breathe. Freedom, they realized, was not only the absence of fences, it was the presence of something that stirred the heart, however softly. As they settled into this understanding, the camp itself seemed to shift. The barbed wire no longer appeared solely as a symbol of limitation, but also as the perimeter of a strange, unexpected refuge, a place where time slowed just enough for reflection to take root. The men discovered that the mind could travel where the body could not, wandering through memories, hopes, and the small rituals that kept them anchored to themselves. They shared stories, wrote letters, and found comfort in the simple act of being heard. These small freedoms did not erase their suffering, but they softened their edges, allowing moments of peace to settle in the spaces between duty and despair. And as the war outside roared on, the men carried these quiet discoveries like lanterns, lighting their way through the final stretch of captivity.
As the final phase of captivity approached, the atmosphere in the camp shifted once more, subtly, like a season changing before anyone names it. Rumors drifted in with the supply wagons and the guards' hushed conversations, hints that the front was moving, that negotiations were stirring, that the war's long shadow might finally be losing its edge. The men didn't cling to these whispers with desperate certainty. They had learned too well how fragile hope could be. But something inside them lifted all the same, a quiet stirring that felt like the first breeze after weeks of still air. The guards, too, seemed changed. Their faces held a softer patience, and their steps lost some of the heaviness that had accompanied them through the hardest months. Instructions were given with a gentler tone, as if everyone sensed that
It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something close, a quiet anticipation that moved through the camp like the first notes of a familiar song, reminding them that life, in its own careful way, was beginning to return. In the end, what stayed with the men long after the war's noise faded was not the shape of the fences or the cold weight of the barracks, but the gentle moments that had slipped quietly into their days. They remembered the guards who softened their voices, the unexpected warmth of shared stories, and the steady ritual of letters that kept their hearts tethered to the world beyond captivity. These small kindnesses, fragile as they seemed, endured far longer than the battles that had carried them into the camp. War had stripped away many things: certainty, pride, the illusion of control, but it had also revealed how deeply human.
As the final phase of captivity approached, the atmosphere in the camp shifted once more, subtly, like a season changing before anyone names it. Rumors drifted in with the supply wagons and the guards' hushed conversations, hints that the front was moving, that negotiations were stirring, that the war's long shadow might finally be losing its edge. The men didn't cling to these whispers with desperate certainty. They had learned too well how fragile hope could be. But something inside them lifted all the same, a quiet stirring that felt like the first breeze after weeks of still air. The guards, too, seemed changed. Their faces held a softer patience, and their steps lost some of the heaviness that had accompanied them through the hardest months. Instructions were given with a gentler tone, as if everyone sensed that
It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something close, a quiet anticipation that moved through the camp like the first notes of a familiar song, reminding them that life, in its own careful way, was beginning to return. In the end, what stayed with the men long after the war's noise faded was not the shape of the fences or the cold weight of the barracks, but the gentle moments that had slipped quietly into their days. They remembered the guards who softened their voices, the unexpected warmth of shared stories, and the steady ritual of letters that kept their hearts tethered to the world beyond captivity. These small kindnesses, fragile as they seemed, endured far longer than the battles that had carried them into the camp. War had stripped away many things: certainty, pride, the illusion of control, but it had also revealed how deeply human
Friendships that formed in quiet corners, of the compassion that crossed enemy lines, and of the simple gestures that had made survival feel less like endurance and more like a shared journey. Years later, when the war existed only in stories and fading photographs, it was those moments of humanity they returned to in their thoughts. And in remembering them, they found a gentle truth, that kindness, even when small, lasts longer than fear, that a single act of mercy can echo across a lifetime, and that even in the harshest chapters of history, the human heart still finds ways to reach for light.